I got it.
Great. So I just want to briefly kind of catch us all up. All right. So, I started 2 weeks ago with a discussion of one of my favorite subjects, which is mistranslation. And how the sort of the founding work of political Zionism by Theodor Herzl was written in German. It's called Der Judenstaat, which is usually translated into English as the Jewish state, but in Hebrew it's called Midinat HaYehudim, which means the state of the Jews. And that is, I'm told, a more accurate translation. In other words, that Israel is the state of the Jews. It is the nation state of the Jewish people, in the same way that, let's say, France is the nation state of the French people, right? Or Italy is the nation state of the Italian people. And this, I have to say, is a foreign concept for many of us who are Americans, because there's no such thing as really being ethnically American in the same way that somebody is ethnically French or ethnically German or ethnically Italian. But a lot, as hopefully I'll get to discuss, a lot of the ideas that seem kind of second nature or self-evident to us as Americans don't necessarily track so easily onto other contexts. And then we spoke quite a bit about the question of whether Israel as a state exists to serve the needs of the Jewish people as a sort of transnational people, or whether it exists to serve the needs of its own citizens, or some combination and some sort of trade-off between those two, and how in essence the COVID epidemic brought some of those issues really to the fore, because Israel, for the most part, closed its borders. There were a lot of diaspora Jews who felt that Israel was violating the covenant between Israel and the diaspora, that somehow diaspora Jews should have had some sort of special status that would have allowed them to come in despite quarantines. And Alan, I saw you kind of shake your head, but there are, particularly in the Orthodox community, right? And if you don't have close friends or relatives who inhabit that community, it may be harder to understand. But most modern Orthodox Jews of the age of most of the members of this class have grandchildren in Israel, right? I mean, if you have 4 or 5 kids, which is not unusual, 1 or 2 of them for sure are going to live in Israel, and you're going to have Israeli grandchildren. It's not unusual at all for people to own apartments in Israel that they may live in, a couple of months a year. And so, some of the proposals were not necessarily, I think even nobody suggested that Israel adopt regulations that said Jews can visit despite the quarantine, but people who have grandchildren in Israel can visit despite the quarantine, or people who own apartments in Israel can visit despite the quarantine, which would have, almost been entirely, Jews, but the regulations would not have said Jews, right? And then the flip side of that was when Israel did let in some birthright trips and not let in Christian pilgrims during Christmas, right? Again, created this not perception, this reality of differential treatment of Jews and non-Jews. So it's a complicated issue, right? And then I spoke about Mansour Abbas, who is the head of an Israeli Islamist political party called Ra'am, which has 4 seats. And Abbas and Ra'am are a part of the governing coalition, which is a big deal because you have to have 61 seats in the Knesset to put together a coalition, and the current coalition has exactly 61 seats. And you have, Naftali Bennett, who, by the way, only has 7 seats. I mean, the biggest party in the coalition is Yesh Atid, which is headed by Yair Lapid, and Yesh Atid is again, Israeli categories don't neatly map over American categories, but if you had to put Yesh Atid, it's a center-left party, okay? I mean, if I was to, try to think of, American politicians who might fit comfortably in Yesh Atid. I don't know.
Dick Durbin.
I mean, sort of moderate centrist Democrats. But because it is a newer party, so it has a kind of younger image. So, I don't know, maybe Cory Booker would fit neatly into Yesh Atid, right? Who, but Lapid realized that he would not be able to put together a coalition with himself as the head, so he gave it over to Bennett. But Bennett's party and also Lieberman's party, which are both in the coalition, and Bennett and Lieberman are both former chiefs of staff for Benjamin Netanyahu. And they don't have significant political disagreements with Netanyahu. They just hold him to be anti-democratic and untrustworthy. Primarily because he's anti-democratic and untrustworthy. Lieberman a little bit, because Lieberman's party represents, for the most part, immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and therefore, who are secular, many of them not halachically Jewish, so they have a fairly stronger stand against the role of the ultra-Orthodox in Israeli society, whereas Bennett is modern Orthodox. And modern Orthodox Jews have a tendency to kind of be always looking over their right shoulder. So that is one difference. But Abbas gave a TV interview and a speech where he basically said, look, we don't challenge the fact that this is a Jewish state, okay? It was created as a Jewish state. The Jewish people made this decision. We have to accept and accommodate this. It's unchangeable, and he says, this is a direct quote: Israel was born as a Jewish state, and that was the decision of the Jewish people to establish a Jewish state. The question is not what is the identity of the state. That's how the state was born, and so it will remain. This is the reality. The question is not about the state's identity, but what the status of Arab citizens will be in it, Abbas said. In other words, basically, Abbas feels that by being inside the system rather than outside the system, his constituents can get a bigger share of the pie, right? And so if you look at, you know, you want to again track this onto American disputes, we'd say that Abbas is Martin Luther King, right? And that the other Arab party, the Joint List, is more like Malcolm X was. All right, that we can, you know, we can get more by being inside the system than outside the system. And that's pretty much where we left it 2 weeks ago. And since then, a few days ago, there was an article. There's this fellow by the name of Yair Rosenberg, who writes a blog for The Atlantic. He used to write for Tablet magazine, which is a right of center, but often thought, I shouldn't say but, is right of center and often publishes thoughtful pieces about Jewish life. And Rosenberg now writes for The Atlantic. His blog is called Deep Shtetl, which is sort of a pun there, but and it's intentionally provocative. But he's an interesting writer, and his latest blog is called Israel's Version of the Latin X Question. Okay, and by this he means, so he's talking about the nomenclature for Arab citizens of Israel, okay? And why he calls it the Israeli version of the Latin X question is that a few years ago, basically white progressives noticed that Latino is a gendered term, right? So they instead of saying Latino, they said Latin X instead of like Latino/Latina. But it turns out that pretty much the only people who use the term Latin X are white progressives, right? Latinos don't use it. Most Latinos don't even recognize it. Several Latino members of Congress have strictly forbidden their staffs to use this term in any sort of public correspondence. And, you know, apparently to use this term, you know, shows that you don't know the community whose interests you're claiming to kind of represent. And so there's a similar debate in Israel, and I'm assuming that most of you know this, but I want to just make certain that we understand the groups to which I'm referring. Okay, so in 1948, right, hundreds of thousands of Arabs who lived within the borders of what became the state of Israel left. Okay, now, whether they fled, whether they were pushed out, whether they were urged by their leaders to leave, that is a historical question that I am not qualified to resolve, but is essentially irrelevant for this discussion, right? Those who remained became citizens of the state of Israel, okay? And today they make up around 17 to 20% of the citizens of the state of Israel. Okay, they have Israeli passports, they're citizens, they vote, they serve in the Knesset, they serve in the diplomatic corps. It's not unusual to find, Israeli, and again, the terminology is fraught, but I'll just say Israeli Arabs for now. Israeli Arabs have been ambassadors, have been consuls. There is a higher they are overrepresented in medical personnel. Like I said, roughly 20% of the population of Israel is Arab, but roughly 25% of the physicians are Arabs, et cetera, et cetera. The question,
Okay.
they are, not, on paper, they are full citizens, right? On paper, they are full citizens. Nevertheless, there's certainly institutional discrimination, okay? First of all, they're not drafted into the army, and a lot of status in Israel depends on not only did you serve in the army, but what you did, right? It's like if we say, if in America, where you go to college or where you go to law school if you're a lawyer, or where you go to med school if you're a doctor, has a lot to do with your future success. In Israel, what unit you served in the army has a lot to do with that. Okay, so that if you're not serving in the army, right, many jobs are closed for certain fields of study because they are considered like security sensitive, are closed, et cetera, et cetera. But on paper, they are equal citizens, right? So the question now becomes, like, what is the terminology? Okay, and so here is from Rosenberg's article. Said in 2019, a survey by progressive pollsters Dahlia Scheindlin and David Rice found that while 14% of Arabs in Israel identified as Palestinian, 19% preferred Palestinian Israeli, 22% went with Arab, and a full 46% chose Arab Israeli. In a 2020 survey by Professor Camille Fuchs, they offered a few more options and got even more remarkable results. Given the option to identify as simply Israeli, 23% of Arab respondents picked that label. 15% chose Arab, 51% opted for Arab Israeli, and just 7% went with Palestinian. This growing Arab identification with Israel is part of a broader pattern. Already in 2017, polls found that 60% of Arab citizens held a positive view of the Israeli state, even as 47% felt that they were treated unequally. Of the Arabs surveyed, 63% said that Israel was a positive place to live, compared with 34% who said it was not. Another survey that year found that 51% of Arabs in Israel describe themselves as quite proud or very proud to be Israeli, while 56% of Arab respondents characterized the country's situation as good or very good, compared with just 44% of Jewish respondents. Okay, so you find a very, very high level of identification with Israel among Arab citizens of Israel, at the same time that they still also identify as part of the Palestinian people, right? And you note this, I mean, in a lot of different ways. I mean, I can give a couple of examples, even like from my own experience. For example, in the summer of 1985, I spent 2 months doing research at a college called Givat Haviva. Givat Haviva is the education college of the kibbutz movement, and it's located in an area of Israel with a fairly high Arab population. It's right on the border between Israel and the West Bank. And one of the things that it also dedicates itself to, it has an ulpan where Jewish Israelis can go to study Arabic, and it promotes Arab culture and so on and so forth. So I was doing some research there. I was living on campus, and one night I went to a concert of Arab music. Most of the people attending were Arab Israelis, and it got very hot, and people were chattering, and I don't understand Arabic, but they were saying whatever they were saying, and then I kept hearing the word mizganim. Okay, mizganim is Hebrew for air conditioners. Okay, I mean, in the same way that, like, if you had parents or grandparents who spoke Yiddish, right, but there was a lot of English in their Yiddish, right? Well, so there's a lot of Hebrew in Israeli Arabic. So mizganim. I don't know how you say air conditioners in Arabic, but they were saying mizganim. Okay, so that's like one thing that I noticed. I mean, also, there are a couple of villages that were divided in half by the 1948 armistice line. And so, people live on the Israeli side, and they have cousins on the other side. I mean, I noticed the same thing in Nogales, right? You have people on the Arizona side and on the Sonora side, cousins. Right? But Israeli Arabs can go in the West Bank, and everybody looks at them and knows that they're Israeli Arabs. Or conversely, people come from the West Bank and they Arab villages in Israel, and everybody knows from there the West Bank. They wear different clothes, they walk differently. I mean, it's a real cultural difference. And back in like 2002, 2003, I was invited as a panelist. It may interest you to know that the Hebrew University has a Center for the Study of Christianity, and they were doing a conference on the teaching of Christianity in Israeli schools. And I was invited to participate as a panelist to talk about the teaching of Christianity in American Jewish schools. And I met this guy. I'm still in touch with him occasionally. Really, really interesting guy by the name of Samuel Fanous. And he is a Christian Arab Israeli who is an Anglican priest. Okay, and he did his seminary training at the Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria. Okay, if you've ever been on Seminary Road in Alexandria, it's a fairly major thoroughfare. It's called Seminary Road because the Anglican seminary is on that road, or the Episcopal seminary. There's Episcopal in the United States, Anglican in most of the rest of the world. So he came to the United States to go to seminary, and he went back. I mean, there aren't that many Anglicans in that part of the world, so the same diocese covers Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan. Okay, and the bishop sent him to be the rector of a church in Ramallah, okay, which is in the West Bank. It's really the capital of the West Bank, and it did not work out. Okay, the cultural differences between West Bank Anglican Christian Palestinians and Israeli Anglican Christian Palestinians was too great. It just didn't work out. Okay, so he was reassigned to Ramleh, which is inside the state of Israel. Okay, and he was at this conference, and he said, and I remember word for word what he said. Ani gael lehiyot chelek miYisrael. Okay, I am proud to be part of Israel. Okay, and what we're talking about actually was the teaching of Judaism, right, to Christians, right? Because there's this whole history of Christian anti-Judaism and Nostra Aetate and how the teaching of Christianity was changed and so on and so forth. And he said, that he's very proud as a Christian to be part of Israel, and that he wants his Christian parishioners to have a positive appreciation of Judaism and the Jewish roots of Christianity. He says, but my state is at war with my people. And right, his state being Israel, his people being the Palestinians. My state is at war with my people. And until that's resolved, it's very, very hard, when I'm trying to teach my parishioners to appreciate Judaism, right? And the soldiers who are coming in and scaring them are all Jews, right? It's a complicated issue, right? But to get back to Abbas, right? So he says Abbas campaigned on, we want to work within the system to get our fair share of the pie, and they got almost half the Arab vote, which cemented the anti-Netanyahu coalition. And then in November, the coalition enacted the largest funding allocation for Israel's Arab community in the country's history. Okay, so Rosenberg's right. It turns out many Arabs in Israel didn't want to disassociate from Israeli society. They just wanted their fair share of its promises to its citizens. They wanted to integrate, not separate, and they were willing to vote for parties and politicians who advanced that cause, even at the cost of deprioritizing but not abandoning Palestinian nationalism. This may have been anathema to certain left-wing activists and incomprehensible to anti-Arab right-wing racists, but it was and is an electoral reality. And it stems from the fact that the Arab community in Israel is far more diverse and complex than many give it credit for, right? So this is and as I mentioned last time, and this is maybe not so much an Israeli version of the Latinx problem, but an Israeli version of defund the police, right? Is that if you look at, you know, Eric Adams, right, who was just elected mayor of New York City, right, a former police officer, right, African American, ran on a platform of reducing crime, right? I mean, you know, activists may talk about defunding the police, but many African Americans simply want better policing, right? They want the police in their neighborhood. They also want the police to not, you know, randomly stop kids because they're Black. They don't want police, you know, to commit violence and shoot people and so on and so forth, but they want better policing and they want more policing. And the same is true of the Arab citizens of Israel, right? The murder rate, because Arabs mostly live, I mean, in, you know, one of the differences is that Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis live for the most part in different towns, right? I mean, Haifa is a mixed city, Yaffo is a mixed city, but for the most part, Arab Israelis live in pretty much purely Arab towns. And the murder rate is sky high. They want more police and better police, right? And you know, a lot of cops, a lot of Arab cops in Israel, right? So the role of, you know, Israel as a state of all its citizens, right, versus a Jewish state, right? Because a few years ago, right, they passed the nation state law, right? And at that time, Benjamin Netanyahu said, I mean, and he said this explicitly, it was in a tweet, Israel is not the state of all its citizens. Israel is the state of the Jewish people alone, right? And, you know, the nation state law kind of deprioritized Arabic. It went from being a co-official language to a language with special status, but not a second official language. You know, it raised the hackles not only of Arab Israelis, but especially of Druze Israelis, right, who are an Arabic-speaking religious minority. They have their own religion, and they have been, you know, loyal to the state from the very beginning, and they took this as a slap in the face, right? So the question of Israel as a Jewish state versus a state of its citizens, you know, and I'll stop here because I'm really interested both in questions and also responses to what I've had to say so far. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. I watched some, not all, but much of what you did last time, and in this, and it dawns on me that this is what you're really talking about is a balancing act. There's a graph. I mean, at some point, this is the rights of the non-Jewish Israelis, and this is the need for Israel to be Jewish. But there's a point where they intersect. The Druze are a very good point. But when you talk about something Netanyahu did, that's not to jump on somebody when he's down, but that was purely a political move, of course.
Sure.
And it's just playing to, I'll say, his constituency, for want of any other term. But that's what it is, and that's politics. That's the way that works. This has been interesting in that you're talking about the situation in Israel, and sort of an overview of the place. Uh, I'm not sure what else we can do. You know, I recently saw an interview with Ian and Sylvia, who were folk singers from Canada back in the 1960s, and played in Washington a lot. And they were asked why they didn't really take more part in the anti-war protests and so forth. And they said, well, you know, we're Canadian, and it would look, we can't just come into the United States and tell you this is what you all should be doing. You know, we're not comfortable doing that. And to some extent, we here in Kilat Shalom, but even though we may have connections to Israel, we're visitors. We are not citizens per se of Israel, and unless you have grandchildren or whatever, you're probably not going to be able to get in there anyway if there's a lockdown, and probably properly. But I think it's important to get a sense of the place and to understand that they're moving the positions back and forth depending on the political reality.
Right. Okay. So I appreciate what you said. It's a lot of food for thought, and it gives me a lot of room to respond. So I'll try to do that in a number of. I mean, I hear what you say about Ian and Sylvia. Neil Young certainly didn't feel that way when he wrote Ohio. You know, and Neil Young also Canadian. So, but the point is well taken. I mean, in terms of Netanyahu, I mean, yeah, and he may not even have believed what he said, right? It's politics. In the same way that I had taken heat at times for saying that I don't actually believe that Trump is an anti-Semite. I don't. I believe that he had no problem weaponizing anti-Semitism for his own, you know, political purposes, but that he personally is probably not an anti-Semite. I mean, he holds views of Jews that we may think are anti-Semitic, but he thinks are complementary, right? So, you know, I'm not willing to excuse in Netanyahu things that I'm not willing to excuse in Trump, right? You know, but the larger question is, I mean, and it gets really to the heart of the matter, which is that if Israel is the state of the Jews, right, then we should have a say, and it should matter to us, right? I mean, the question of how much of a say is one of the complicated and controversial issues, right? But you know, for example, right, the state of Israel has made me an immigration clerk, right? I mean, if somebody can become a citizen of Israel on the basis of a piece of paper that I give them, right? I mean, I didn't ask for that assignment, right? But I can't really turn it down either, right? I mean, if somebody grew up in Kehilat Shalom, right, and the records that are going to substantiate their claim to citizenship are in the filing cabinets in my office, I can't really just say to them, I have a moral objection to this, go somewhere else. It just, you know, so that, you know, or the fact, for example, you know, that on the basis of this letter that I have the authority to write, I can become a citizen of Israel tomorrow, right? So it's not, I mean, we're foreigners, but we're not foreigners in that sense, right? And this is precisely why it's a complicated question, right? And it's also why, like I say, I mean, some of these ideas don't sit well with American notions, right? I mean, the idea that you have, for example, right, the Masorti movement, the Israeli conservative movement, constantly fighting for its fair share of the pie, right? Whereas an American civil libertarian, the existence of the pie itself is problematic to me, right? I mean, the fact that we are eligible for increasing amounts of government money for our shul is problematic to me, right? But since the government isn't willing to assign 24/7 police protection to our building, right? And they say, well, we can't do this, so take this bucket of money and figure out for yourself. It's a reality, right? It's a reality. It's a problematic reality, but it's a problematic reality caused by the rise of anti-Semitism in this country and the government's inability to successfully fight it in other ways, right? But it's a problem. But having said that, I mean, you talk about Ian and Sylvia, right? I mean, is Canada less free than the United States? I don't think so, right? But they have a different system, right? And for a long time in the province of Quebec, right? I mean, I remember I gave a sermon once about Protestant Jews and Catholic Jews, right? But in the province of Quebec, there were literally Protestant Jews and Catholic Jews, right? Because the school systems were not secular. The English language school system was Protestant. It was a public school system that was Protestant and taught in English. And the French language school system was public and it was Catholic and it taught in French. And, for most of the history of the Montreal Jewish community, Jews were Protestant, right? Today, since immigration of French-speaking Jews, first from Morocco and then from France itself. So now there are Catholic Jews as well as Protestant Jews, right? And since the rise of Quebecois nationalism, a lot of Montreal Jews have moved to Toronto, right? But, I mean, it's just a different system. I don't know. I certainly don't think that Jews in Canada are less free than Jews in the United States, but they don't have the absolute separation of church and state that we have in this country, right? And I don't, there are aspects of what goes on in Israel. I mean, but primarily the thing that is disturbing about what goes on in Israel is where it does infringe on people's freedom. The fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people who can't legally get married in Israel at all because there's no civil marriage, right? And their halachic status. Now, so it's solved by going to Cyprus, right? But what if you can't afford to go to Cyprus, right? I mean, and so, but these are problems that have solutions without necessarily dismantling the whole idea of Israel as a Jewish state. Yeah, Val. Need to unmute, yeah.
Is it correct, or is it too pushing it to an extreme, to rephrase the question of the discussion of today, that the choices of Israel are between being a Jewish state or being a democracy?
Well, look, I mean, I think, that's a very good segue, right? Because, I mean, if you look at the Israeli political spectrum, right, the far right and the far left both agree with the following statement. It is impossible for Israel to be both a Jewish state and a democracy, right? So the far left says, therefore, let us jettison the Jewish identity of the state, right? The far right says, therefore, let us jettison democracy, right? And the 80% of people in the middle want to find some sort of balance, right? And where you draw that line to create the balance, that is precisely the subject of the debate, right? I mean, in other words, I think Israel should be both a Jewish state and a democratic state. And I don't know precisely what that looks like, right? I mean, I can identify specific abuses that I think need to be rectified, right? And I can identify specific things that, might not fly in this country, but I think are appropriate in Israel. That, for example, the army should be kosher, right? I mean, that's a minor infringement on non-Jewish soldiers or non-observant soldiers, right? But the fact that the army should be kosher, I think, is a minor enough infringement, right? Or the fact that, cafeterias in government buildings should be kosher, right? Or the fact that people should not be forced to work on Shabbat, right? But I think the flip side is that people should be allowed to keep their place of business open on Shabbat if they want to, which is not always the case either, right? So it is a question of drawing a balance, right? But it's also, and this is why, it's a good segue. I mean, we've really only spoken about inside the borders of the state of Israel, right? We haven't spoken about, the situation of the Arab residents of the West Bank who are not Israeli citizens, right? And this is where I think it's a much tougher issue, right? Because the security trade-offs, I think, are, much harder. But the flip side is that, this increasing, and again, you have both the far left and the far right agreeing that the two-state solution is dead, right? I mean, for me, I think the two-state solution is the only solution, right? But you have people on the far left saying the two-state solution will never work because the populations are too highly intermingled. There's 250,000 Israelis who now live in West Bank settlements. It's impossible to lifarek, to dismantle those settlements. and that therefore the task is to make the West Bank Palestinians equal citizens, right? Which to me means the end of the state of Israel within 50
As a
years.
Jewish, yeah.
Right.
I somehow feel that just the fact that we discuss this matter and that Israel has a choice is a luxury. And what my personal fear is that along the time coming, that luxury will stop somehow, somewhere. And I'll give you what I mean. It's, again, an extreme example. Was in 1967, was it kosher that Israel bombed the Egyptian airfields? I don't know, by the rules of the war or what have you. But it was something that had to be done.
Right.
Regardless. And I wonder how much more Israel will have this luxury to discuss with Pepsi if it should do some this or that, because the time might come when it will have to do some stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I agree with that statement. I think we might approach it from different, perspectives, right? But because then the other side, the far right, the Israeli far right, says that, also the creation of a two-state solution is impossible, and therefore we have to either kick the Palestinians out or let them to continue to live without citizenship. The problem with that is that the idea one person, one vote, right, is not a particularly controversial concept, right? And it's one of the reasons why Israel is losing support among younger American Jews, because it is increasingly perceived as undemocratic. I just read an article today in the Bulwark that Israel is losing support among young evangelicals, right? Precisely for the same reason. And this is ironic, because Netanyahu quite explicitly said, screw the American Jews, we don't need them, we have the evangelicals, right?
Yeah.
But they're not only losing the American Jews, they're losing the evangelicals as well, right? And that to me, time is not on Israel's side. Time is not on Israel's side, and that a negotiated settlement sooner rather than later is better than a settlement that the world is going to force on Israel, right? Because I get back to something that Dennis Ross said years ago, right? It was right after Israel signed the Oslo Agreement, right? And if you remember, I mean, Israel swore up and down that it would never negotiate with the PLO until it did, right? And overnight, saying Israel should negotiate with the PLO went from being heresy to being orthodoxy, right? And so Dennis Ross, who ran the Middle East for both, for the first Bush and for Clinton, came and was a member of Beth El, active identified Jew, came and spoke to the Board of Rabbis. And, people were like, why did Rabin do this? And Rabin, who was, a hardliner vis-a-vis security issues. And Ross said Rabin's analysis is that American support for Israel is based in the perception of the average American that the Israelis are just like us, right? That the Israelis are just like, in many ways. I mean, certainly, any Israeli who's in the public eye in the United States speaks good English, right? Most of them unaccented English, right? They have gone to many of them have gone to American universities. It's a democracy. Basketball is the most popular sport in Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Whereas Arabs are still perceived as unlike us, right? And that the support of the American public is a crucial ingredient in Israel's security. That what keeps America on the side of Israel is not the American Jewish community, it is the support of the American public. And if the support of the American public evaporates because Israel is perceived as like South Africa, right? And the latest survey says that 25% of American Jews, 25% of American Jews agree with the statement that Israel is an apartheid state, right? I'm not interested in arguing it. I do not agree with it, but it doesn't matter. And, rabbis getting up and giving sermons to shuls full of people who are already pro-Israel doesn't do any good, right? I mean, Israel has to do something to change the perception, right? And it's, I'll get to you in a second, it's very hard with the current government, right? I mean, it's better than Netanyahu, but at least the idea that Bennett and Lapid both agree on to shrink the occupation, meaning it's not feasible for Israel to withdraw from the territories, and it's not feasible to establish a Palestinian state now, but we're going to strive to make the occupation less oppressive in the daily lives of Palestinians, and going to refrain from taking steps that make it even more unlikely that a negotiated settlement will ever be reached. In other words, kind of putting it on the back burner, which is, to my mind, not ideal, but it's a less bad alternative than what was going on before. Alan.
Robert, you've really identified the major problem that we have here, and that is Israel is so much more powerful than the Palestinians, and Israel has legitimate security issues that they have to deal with. The problem is when you're in a position like that, it's easy enough to say, to refer to the other group as the other, and you don't care about them as much. And you figure that you have friends in the United States, you have media at some point that's going to say, yeah, these people are just dirty, whatever, whatever. The way to really to govern something is to show respect at any level. If you're not showing respect, people can appreciate that immediately. And you have Arabs that, as a result of that, are saying, they're not for me. But you also have people that are radical within the Arab movement, within any movement, saying the only way to fight these folks is with guns, and we need to blow this up, even though it's totally irrational. The situation in Texas last week, 2 weeks ago, is exactly that. It's absurd to think that somebody's going to really be able to leverage that. But there are a number of absurd people. So Israel's problem is to be able to deal with issues itself, to still maintain a decent, a moral government as we see that, but as they see it too, within the tradition. And their tradition, there are places where there are difference, but we need to be able to protect Israel, but also for them to try to work to make it a better situation.
Yeah, and it's complicated, and I think there is, it's legitimate to recognize that complexity, right? And this idea that we should say Israel's always right, it's just not so, and it's not convincing anybody. Val?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to, I started saying it before, that it's very, we think that we've analyzed all the options and all the possibilities. Two states, single state, what have you, democracy. But it's almost funny, although nothing related to Trump can be called funny. But it's funny how he found another way, which was to buy certain Arab states to reconnect with Israel. And how did he do it? He gave Morocco a portion of the Sahara that it was not his to give. It still fought between Morocco and Algeria. But that pushed the Moroccans to the diplomatic table. And I think the reason why some of the Emirates are, I don't even forgot how those Abraham treaties are called, whatever.
Abraham Accords, yeah.
Abraham, of course, is because they have certain economic interests, and
Sure.
Trump trying to convince them that it's economically feasible. So that's what I meant by it's so hard to guess what the future has.
For sure. No, and look, I would say, and I'm going to like arrogate to myself the privilege of the last word, right? Is that look, I think the Abraham Accords on balance are a net plus, right? I mean, I think that anything that increases the ties between Israel and Arab states is a plus for the peoples of the region. If it increases Israel's feeling of security and feeling that Israel is accepted as a legitimate part of the Middle East by more Arab states, it can free them to take more risks to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? If they do it. I mean, if the flip side is if Israel feels, well, we can just ignore the Palestinian issue, then that hurts Israel, right? I mean, if your feeling of strength and security allows you to deal with a problem, that's great. If it convinces you that you can simply ignore a problem, that becomes problematic, right? And it, it remains to be seen, right? But somehow, because of my past involvement in interfaith stuff, I'm now on a list of rabbis that were being reached out to by the Moroccan Interfaith Association, right? And the head of that association, is kind of inviting me to come to Morocco. I mean, the minute that he invites me to come to Morocco and the invitation is accompanied by a plane ticket, I'm there, right? But the invitation is nice, but it's not, so far it's not enough, but who knows? I mean, I'm not eager to travel right now anyway. But it's definitely, it's a net plus. But I think Israel, in my mind, has to exploit it to take some risks and be generous, because if you have the upper hand, the onus really is on you, I think, to take steps to resolve the problem. Anyway, we've run over. Thank you very much. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
Rabbi,
shalom.
thank you, and thank you for preparing for this. It's a lot of material.
Thanks.
Thank you. Shabbat
Night.
shalom.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Shabbat shalom.